Your body creates the antibodies it needs, but scientific research needs more. Today, how animals are harmed for their antibodies by blood-sucking companies. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, blood-sucking for antibodies. PETA was the key source for a recent expose of ProSci of San Diego, cited 39 times for violations of animal protection laws. Animals big and small were found neglected and abused in the process as ProSci mined the animal's blood for antibodies.
This is a horror, and more people in my field, more scientists need to acknowledge this. Most people who use antibodies in their research, so doctors, scientists across the board, don't think about this side of things. And the more they do think about this side of things, the easier it is for us to come to them and say, but there is a better way of doing this.
Jeff Brown, researcher with PETA's Regulatory Testing Department, says there's a non-animal testing way that they can use. Companies like ProSci know it, but hang on to their antiquated ways at the expense of the animals.
These rabbits are confined in these wire cages. Even the bottom of the cage is just open wire. And there are rabbits whose toenails have grown so long that they're basically hooking through the floor of these enclosures. And the thought of hundreds of rabbits in similar conditions, these cages are covered in feces. The rabbits can barely move around. They're injured. They're underweight.
More about those blood-sucking companies' search for antibodies and how it all could be better with some help from listeners like you. That's next on the PETA Podcast. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. Please share a link with your friends and let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. Go to our webpage at PETA.org and binge up on some of my favorites, starting with PETA President and co-founder Ingrid Newkirk. That's always a good one. Listen to her debunk all the myths you've heard about PETA and animal rights directly, straight from Ingrid's mouth. And hear Ingrid's words on why mothers on the southern border should have never been separated from their children. That's on episode 24. A cow is a child is an immigrant. Did you visit SeaWorld this summer to protest? Well, they're still at it at SeaWorld, and orcas are still at risk. Listen to Lisa Lange talk about the state of SeaWorld on episodes 6 and 21. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always just hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. PETA's Jeff Brown, a former lab researcher, joined PETA's Regulatory Testing Department when he realized there's a better way to do science. One way in particular is in the way researchers get the antibodies they need for research, even cancer research. But animals aren't necessary for any of that. Yet at ProSci in San Diego, dozens of animals get their blood harvested in cycles in a painful process. The antibodies then are sold to government labs like NIH and the National Cancer Institute. And since the blood is what they want, the companies show little care for the animals. Here's my talk with Jeff Brown on the process and what you can do to change it on this episode of the PETA Podcast. So, Jeff, I watched that news story that ran on the NBC affiliate. Pretty upsetting. A company called ProSci is using rabbits, llamas, goats, and other animals to create antibodies, and photographs from federal inspectors show that the animals are living in filth, and rabbits with overgrown teeth and abscesses, and other animals with overgrown hooves. So they're not being cared for because I guess these companies, or this company in particular, only cares about getting those antibodies and they don't care about the condition of the animals. And that we have the U.S. Department of Agriculture finding that ProSci violated animal protection laws at least 39 times. So let's start at the beginning. What are these antibodies that companies like ProSci are trying to get? And what do animals have to do with making these antibodies?
Most of us have probably at least heard the word antibodies. These are these little sticky molecules that our immune systems make. And they're sticky because they stick to things like viruses and bacteria. So whenever we have an infection, there are special cells in our blood that sort of recognize that there's something going wrong. And they make antibodies that stick to these invading cells so that the immune system can clear them out. So that's the background, but that's important because your body, animals' bodies, can make antibodies that stick to just about anything.
Antibodies are like the fighters, and we have natural antibodies in our system. So what do the animals, and what do making or getting or harvesting essentially antibodies from these animals, what do they have to do with us as humans?
It's sort of a mixed bag. I mean, we can make antibodies from humans and human cells, just like we can from other animals. I think the bigger question is that in the past, we've really only made antibodies one way, and that's by using antibodies. This was discovered as a way to make these research tools more than 100 years ago, and so we've been doing that ever since.
Well, wait a minute. What you're saying is you make antibodies from other antibodies, so it doesn't matter who's making them, right? If you have antibodies, you can make more for the use of any living thing. Is that it?
Yeah, essentially. What the companies like ProSci do is they sort of artificially tell an animal's body that there's an infection by injecting these animals with whatever the substance is that company wants to make an antibody that sticks to. That's how these industries have sprung up.
It doesn't really get to the blood, or they inject a substance into the animal, but does it get to the bloodstream? Do they suck out blood, or do they suck out that substance that has the antibodies that the animal's antibodies stick to? How does that work?
That's exactly right. There are several ways of doing this, but the one that you mentioned is probably the most common. So after an animal's been injected with whatever these researchers want to make an antibody against, then it takes a couple of weeks for that animal's immune system to start cranking out antibodies, and that's just released right into their blood. So to get those antibodies out of the animals have to be bled repeatedly, every 2 to 4 weeks. And then you can sort of filter out the antibodies from the blood. And this process just continues.
Yeah, so they're essentially like blood mills, right? There's these companies like ProSci in San Diego and others like them that are in the antibody business are essentially sucking the blood out of these animals, harvesting it, and then selling it, and that's their business, right?
That's the business. The animals are there just because they have blood, right? So there's no necessary reason to use a whole animal because we can completely make antibodies without using whole animals at this point. The technology's been around for decades. It's pretty perfected, but companies are not willing to change. They make these products. They've had them on the market for a long time. They don't see any pressure to change until news stories like this come out.
So really, the news story is not just that they're making antibodies, but that the U.S. Department of Agriculture found that ProSci violated animal protection laws by, at least 39 times with how these animals were treated. And yet it doesn't, is there much of an alarm just because they get cited, or is that just considered the cost of doing business?
That's absolutely the cost of doing business. And, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And when you see how these animals are held, the conditions that they live in, the kind of treatment that they are denied access, it does sort of put the broad underline underneath why this industry is in bad shape. Like I said, it's not just an ethical concern about do we have to keep using these animals? That question's been answered. No, we don't have to keep using animals. And I don't think many scientists, I don't think many people in the public recognize that we hear about antibodies. They're really everywhere. They're a really basic tool in biomedical research. But when we usually encounter them, they're in these little tiny vials of clear liquid. We don't think about the experience of the animals behind them.
So they're really kind of faceless, bodiless antibodies that came from these llamas and pigs and rabbits and all these kind of different animals. It's like a little farm, but it's not. It's a blood farm. They're just harvesting blood and selling these antibodies. Are there a lot of these kind of companies around, or is ProSci just one company, a rare company, or are there a lot of them all over the country?
No, they're not. There are dozens and dozens in the U.S. alone, probably hundreds worldwide, that go through the same process and use all different kinds of animals and species. So ProSci is not unique. Everywhere we've looked into facilities that use animals for these purposes, we find similar situations. Animals held in these subpar conditions, and even in the best conditions, they're still repeatedly injected with toxins and other substances, and routinely have to deal with blood draws, oftentimes for their entire life.
And so it's like a cycle. It's like because once they get the blood drawn from them, then they have to sort of recharge and and just regenerate, right? And then I guess how often would the cycle last, or how long before the next injection or test or withdrawal?
It usually happens at least once a month for their entire lives. Sometimes it can be as often as every 2 weeks. It really depends on what species you're talking about. And this also has to do with what the product that these companies are selling, these antibodies, they're in very small amounts in the bloodstream. And that's why you see these pictures from companies like ProSci, and there are rows upon rows upon rows of filthy cages with rabbits in them. And that's because for every rabbit, you only get a tiny amount of antibody. And so it's an industry of scale, and these companies have to use tremendously large numbers of animals or gigantic animals like horses who just have a lot of blood. So you get more of it per amount of blood that you withdraw from a larger animal than a smaller animal.
So either you go with a lot of smaller animals and do a lot of these tests, or you ramp it up and get a bigger animal, and yet like a horse or a llama, I guess they were using too. And yet all these animals undergo, I mean, it's not pleasant, right? I mean, is it painful? Or is this the conditions that they're put in? Is that the painful thing?
The entire experience is painful. I mean, at the very basis, we're talking about routine injections and blood draws using needles. These aren't easy procedures. Animals don't want to, receive these injections. And some of the rabbits, for instance, at ProSci, you see in the images from these inspections that they still have blood that's crusted on their ears and necks. And that's from after a blood draw has been done. If a veterinarian or a technician doesn't help the bleeding stop, then they're just going to continue bleeding. That's not a good way to deal with situations like this.
And a lot of these animals are injected directly into their abdomens, I understand.
Right. There's one specific way of making these antibodies. It's particularly barbaric. It's so inhumane that it's banned in many countries, and even the National Institutes of Health tries to discourage it. And it's a way to essentially make the cells that make antibodies, they're fused with cancer cells, which reproduce really quickly. And when those cells are injected into an animal's abdomen, they reproduce, they make a little tumor, and that tumor pumps out liquid, and it forms an even bigger tumor that swells into the abdomen cavity. And then to get the antibodies out, the technicians have to put a needle into that tumor and drain off the fluid every once in a while.
So that leads to the next question, which is if they create cancer tumors, I guess it's pretty obvious who buys these antibodies and, how it's used for disease research. And probably a lot of this is fueled by taxpayer dollars, by government agencies that use taxpayer dollars to buy antibodies from these kind of mills, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The government agencies, National Institutes of Health included, have contracts with companies that make these antibodies. And you can go to the websites of all of these companies. It's basically catalog shopping. Some companies offer hundreds of different kinds of these antibodies, and that's why you see the sheer number of animals at facilities like this. If a company's making 300 different kinds of antibodies that are made from animals, they've got to have 300 different groups of animals who are routinely injected and bled to get those products.
And yet, as we've said, just, in our conversation, a company like ProSci doesn't have to use animals. They can do better, and not just in terms of getting and creating the antibodies, but even by caring for the animals better.
I think at the very basic level, seeing something like 39 violations of really minimal federal animal welfare laws in 3 years, that's very bad. That should be very simple to improve. If companies like this have animals that they're using for these procedures, they absolutely need to be following the laws that are put in place to protect them. At the same time, we know the scientific community for the better part of a decade has really recognized that using antibodies that are made from animals in this way, you don't get good products. Antibodies kind of vary from batch to batch. This is such a big deal that just a few years ago, in 2015, a group of more than 100 scientists who work in this field got together and published this pretty groundbreaking paper that said, look, antibodies made from animals, they don't work well. Sometimes they say that they stick to one thing on the label, but they don't stick to that in reality. It's hard to check. It's hard to know that researchers are getting what they're ordering. And because we know that we can make these antibodies without using animals, using methods that avoid all of those problems, it should be sort of an industry-wide standard at this point to use these non-animal approaches.
So it goes back to the idea that in any kind of lab testing or any kind of vivisection involving animals, you can't rely trans-species on any of the results. I mean, what you get from a rat study or a rabbit study isn't going to help a human. So it's along those lines that if an antibody from a non-human may not have much relevance to things that you're trying to fight in the human species. Is that?
Yeah.
Am I reading that correctly?
That's absolutely correct. As much as we're talking about how antibodies like this can be used just in medical research, they're also used to make drugs, medicines that are injected into humans to treat conditions. And when we're talking about antibodies used in that way, you're even doubly right, because the human body makes human antibodies. Animal bodies make antibodies that the human body recognizes as invaders. So there's even a really serious complication that can come into play here. If a human is injected with an antibody that's made from animals, then the human body can essentially freak out and attack that treatment. It's called serum sickness, and it's a major problem with these drugs.
The researchers know that there is a way to make better antibodies without animals. How is that done to make a better antibody for human purposes, to test cancer drugs or cancer treatment or cures? Because a lot of people, when they probably heard you mention the National Institute of Cancers and National Institute of Health, they probably said, well, that must be a good thing because we need to know these things. It's going to be for the good of humankind. But if it may not be effective and there's a better way, what is that better way?
It's pretty straightforward. When I mentioned why we use animals in the first place to make antibodies, it's just because there are cells in our blood that actually make them. You don't need a whole animal. If it's just these blood cells that make these antibodies. So to make human antibodies, you take blood from a human donor and you identify those cells, and you go through these pretty straightforward technical processes that instead of using a whole animal, just uses human blood cells in a little test tube, and it can go through the exact same process. And at the end, you're left with an antibody that looks like a human antibody.
So essentially, we have an old industry, this antibody harvesting industry, trying to fight the disruption of a more advanced technology, right? I mean, they're trying to stay in business.
That's very well put.
Yeah, at the expense of the animals.
And taxpayers, like you said. I mean, this is a sort of, no one's winning here except for the companies that sell animal antibodies, because they're selling a product that they can charge for. Part of that landmark paper from a few years ago really drives this home for everyone, is to recognize that using these antibodies that are made from animals that don't really work well, that probably is a really big contributor to why drugs that we develop end up failing once they get to humans. We're not really anticipating how the human body is going to react. By switching over to these antibodies that are made from human cells, the total cost of the developing drugs can come down.
And we might get better results.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Better results, more predictive results, a better understanding of how these drugs are going to act in the human body.
Yeah. In the meantime, all we get is perpetuation of the status quo if we keep doing the same thing.
That's correct. And you hit the nail on the head. This is, I think, seen as a disruption of industries that haven't had to change for more than a century. These antibodies have been made from animals for more than 100 years. But now companies are around in the US and Europe that no longer make antibodies from living animals. They use this human blood cell approach.
So it's time to clean up the industry from the companies that don't keep up with the times. Is that it?
That's correct.
So what is PETA doing about this to try to change the industry?
Well, we know for a fact that these non-animal ways of making antibodies are feasible. They're so technically feasible and within reach that the PETA International Science Consortium for the last several years has been funding the development of some of these antibodies.
What is the PETA International Science Consortium?
The consortium is a group of scientists who work for PETA US, but also in other places in the world, for PETA UK, for PETA India, and so on. And we're about 20 full-time scientists where there is an unmet need, in this case, a technical need to switch from one way of using animals to a non-animal approach, then we bring our scientific expertise in. We find the researchers who can work on this project. We help find funding to get these projects underway, and we talk to the companies and government regulators who need to be involved to make sure that we can make a transition. And we're working pretty intently in this antibody area.
And what is an antitoxin? Because I understand that's sort of the new area, antitoxins. And what is the consortium doing about antitoxins?
Well, antitoxin is just a really fancy way of saying an antibody that sticks to a toxin. So a toxin in this case is, let's say, some bacteria and viruses. The bacteria itself, the infection doesn't hurt you, but that bacteria pumps out molecules called toxins that cause some kind of injury. And there's a group of drugs that are made from antibodies that stick to those toxins so that your immune system can clear them out. Until very recently, every single antitoxin on the market was made from animals. And these are almost entirely made from large animals, like horses who've been repeatedly injected with the toxin. And then they have very large volumes of blood drawn every couple of weeks for the same purpose, to isolate that antitoxin from the animal's blood.
So what is the feasibility of the entire industry going to this new non-animal method? Is it really something that is feasible and that can easily be done? Or why are you getting the resistance from some companies?
Well, it's very feasible, and I'd even say it's not just feasible, it's necessary. We've known for a long time that it's hard to keep supplies of antitoxins. So the industry that uses animals to make antitoxins can't keep up with the demand. And the product that they make, it's injected directly into humans. They don't work well. They cause illnesses on their own. They're made from animal blood, so they can have contaminating viruses in them. It's just a mess. Global health authorities in the last decade or so have recognized this, and they recognize that the industry is changing slowly and needs to change faster. And by moving to these human-derived antibodies and antitoxins, that's really the only way that all of these problems can be addressed. But like you said, with companies like ProSci, industries are slow to change unless they're compelled to do so.
And hopefully the story out of San Diego where ProSci is with the 39 violations in terms of animal standards, maybe that will change their minds about how they do things, and maybe other companies who still follow that model. Is there any sense of are we getting close to seeing a change, at least at ProSci, at least at one of them? And if one company goes down, will others follow?
ProSci isn't the first company that's been called out for this kind of behavior. Just a few years ago in India, the PETA International Science Consortium and a veterinarian from PETA India helped the Indian government inspect 10 facilities in India where these antitoxins are manufactured. And the experience of those inspections was very similar to what you see out of ProSci. These horses were kept in filthy conditions. There was minimal, if any, veterinary care provided. And the video and images from those inspections have set off the same kind of discussion in India and in the industry at large. So it really does take efforts like this to show, look, whenever you peek behind the curtain at how these drugs and antibodies are made, you see the same thing. The more awareness of what goes on in facilities that use animals to make these drugs, the more interest you see in coming back and putting some resources into developing these non-animal antitoxins and antibodies.
Well, as you say, once the curtain is drawn and we see, just like in anything, like how food is made or how animals are treated, in factory farms, or when we see the process, we don't realize that there are living things, living beings that are impacted in this process. If people saw pictures of ProSci on the news recently that showed those 39 violations, I guess their minds would be changed, or we hope.
Absolutely. And there are really clear actions that people who have their minds changed can take. Sign an action alert that tells the U.S. government to stop buying contracts for antibody production from these facilities that use animals, and tell them to invest more. Tell them that you as a consumer want to see more modern science being used in place of this cruel animal approach.
And they can go to PETA.org, and also they can do a number of actions, which we'll tell them about on our podcast website as well. But Jeff, was there any? I mean, you follow this regularly. Was there anything that stood out in your mind when you saw the pictures of ProSci, and was there any image that stuck in your mind?
There's one image in particular of a rabbit. These rabbits are confined in these wire cages. Even the bottom of the cage is just open wire. And there are rabbits whose toenails have grown so long that they're basically hooking through the floor of these enclosures. And the thought of hundreds of rabbits in similar conditions, these cages are covered in feces. The rabbits can barely move around. They're injured. They're underweight. I come from a scientific background. I come from a laboratory background. I used to use antibodies in my work all the time. And I know that if I see those images and think, this is a horror, and more people in my field, more scientists need to acknowledge this, that's the kind of image that I'm stuck with. I think that most people who use antibodies in their research, so doctors, scientists across the board, don't think about this side of things. And the more they do think about this side of things, the easier it is for us to come to them and say, but there is a better way of doing this. And the Science Consortium has been funding a project to develop diphtheria antitoxin, a drug that's been made from horses for a century. We're developing the first human-derived replacement for that animal-made antitoxin. And it's a way to start that conversation, to tell them just how feasible and relatively inexpensive and straightforward it is to switch from an animal-derived antibody to a human-derived antibody.
Well, as a former researcher who worked in the labs, you know how they think. How do they shut their eyes? How do they keep going and not acknowledge what you have seen since coming over and working at PETA? How do they do it? How do they compartmentalize their, a certain logic or a certain moral logic to keep doing what they do?
It really is a part of the curriculum. So if you're studying the sciences, if you're an undergraduate or a graduate student now, you are hearing every day that this is the only way it's done. The animals are fine. There are no pictures of the process. There's no real direct relationship from the research community to the animals who are so involved in this process. And so it does take effort to make sure that people who are in that industry, even if you're just separated, one step, you order these antibodies from a catalog and you're not involved in making these antibodies from animals, you absolutely don't think, and you're not presented with the conditions that the animals live in or what they suffer through to get to that final product. And that is hopefully something that's changing. We see it all the time because the internet has made a huge difference in terms of how easy it is to access new information.
Okay.
But this still isn't in textbooks. It's not a part of anyone's training. And that's a problem.
So it's almost like, how it's analogous to, people in certain countries where the internet is banned or where information is censored, and they just live in a kind of government controlled ignorance, right? It's and they live with the propaganda that they're fed. And then suddenly, right, they have access to the internet and they get access to new information. Their eyes are open. They say, well, we don't have to live like this. We can live like, we can live like the rest of the modern world. And they go crazy in some of these countries until the iron hand comes down again. It almost sounds like what's going on in the scientific community in America, that, from if you're studying, your education is all one way, almost propagandistic in a way. And then when you get to the PhD level and you get minted as, hey, I'm the researcher, I'm a doctor, I'm ready to go on the NIH mill and get money from the government to study. It sounds like, this is the reason why it's so hard to turn things around. It's the system is so entrenched, not just people, but the system. And it creates these people who seem to be willing to follow along until their eyes are open.
That's spot on. What has changed, though, is that it's not unusual at this point for scientists in the field to know us, scientists who work for PETA. Times change. We go to conferences. We fund research. We put these projects out there. We present them at meetings and conferences. So it is getting better, and we do know who to go to when we have projects like this. We're working with a laboratory in Germany on this non-animal antitoxin project, and they're a laboratory that helped invent this process of using human blood cells instead of animals to make antibodies. It's no longer, though, that we only have to go to these specialist labs. We take this work to the regulators, to other companies, to other groups who want to sort of take what we've learned and apply it themselves. So anyone who does see stories like this, who is interested in it, can always reach out and ask us for more information. We're happy to help, and we've got a lot of information and resources to share to make that transition much easier than it used to be.
And Jeff, when you were a researcher, what was it for you that said, hey, that's it, I can't do this? What was the thing that you saw that changed your mind and made you want to come to work for PETA?
Well, I went vegetarian very early in life and always had an awareness of this situation. At the same time that I sort of let myself be convinced that using animals was the only way. My background, though, is in cell and molecular biology, and I eventually started working in a laboratory that did a lot of research on bone infections and cancer. And that was really the first time in my career where I was faced with, and essentially every day having to injure animals, to see injured animals, to participate in research studies that I felt had very little merit and were maybe being done for the publications, for career purposes rather than advancing any kind of knowledge that was going to help human health or animal health. And I think many people who you speak with have similar experiences where the idealism of the early part of a scientific career can very quickly press up against the reality of what is behind all of that research. So I think about those bone infection and bone cancer animal studies every day, and it's absolutely what drives the work that I do with PETA.
Jeffrey Brown, thank you for being part of the PETA podcast.
Thank you very much.
Jeff Brown with PETA's Regulatory Testing Department. You can take action now. Just text the word research to 73822. That's research to 73822 to tell the National Cancer Institute to purchase antibodies made only using non-animal methods. You can also go to the link in the show notes or go to PETA.org. And that's our show this time around. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can also find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on amok.com, AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. Remember, it helps get out the word about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals, and PETA especially, if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.